The studio lights glowed like a wall of miniature suns as George Stephanopoulos stepped toward the center of the set. Technicians moved briskly around him, checking cables, adjusting camera angles, and monitoring levels. The anticipation was building, crackling in the air like static before a storm. George had interviewed presidents, adversaries, and the most unpredictable personalities in modern politics, but today felt different. Today, the world's focus narrowed onto one seat. One guest, one interview that had ignited a firestorm before a single question had even been asked. Meghan Markle stood at the edge of the stage, her expression polished yet unreadable. Her team hovered behind her like a protective wall, whispering last-minute adjustments, muttering about lighting, exposure, posture. Meghan breathed in deeply, smoothing her dress with a hand that trembled just slightly. She wasn't nervous, or so she told herself, but the energy radiating from George, from the cameras, from the world that waited to dissect every word she said, this was unlike anything she'd handled before. The director counted down. 3, 2, 1. The red light above the primary camera flared to life. George turned toward the audience with the ease of a man who had mastered this stage decades earlier. "Good evening," he began calmly. "Tonight, a conversation many have been waiting for." Meghan kept her hands folded neatly in her lap. For a moment, she looked every bit the poised, careful public figure the world had come to know. Her eyes followed George as he spoke, searching his tone for hidden currents. When he finally turned his full attention to her, the atmosphere shifted. "Meghan, you've expressed frustration with the way you've been portrayed. You've said the world doesn't understand the full picture. Tonight, I'd like to unpack that, with your help." A flicker passed through her eyes. "I appreciate the chance," Meghan replied smoothly. "I think people deserve the truth, not the version that certain institutions want them to believe." Her words carried weight, almost too much weight. George didn't blink. "And which institutions," he asked, "are you referring to?" She hesitated just a beat. "You know exactly which ones." There it was, the first spark. George leaned slightly forward, not aggressive, not confrontational, simply present, focused, experienced. "Let's talk specifics," he said. "People want clarity, not symbolism." She shifted back in her chair. She wasn't used to this type of directness. Not anymore. Most interviewers treated her delicately, with caution, as though she might shatter under pressure. George was different. He respected the stakes too much for softness. "Clarity," she echoed, composing herself. "Then let's begin with the way my intentions have been twisted. The narrative that George raised a hand, not to interrupt rudely, but to guide. "Before intentions," he said calmly, "we must address facts." Her lips tightened, almost imperceptibly. The director sensed the tension building and signaled the cameras to shift into a tighter frame. The audience at home would see everything: the twitch of an eyebrow, the flick of irritation, the micro-expressions that revealed more truth than any polished speech. Meghan exhaled. "Facts," she repeated, this time slower. George glanced at his notes but didn't need them. "You've suggested repeatedly that the media, and even elements of the royal establishment, work to silence or diminish you. Can you point specifically to who or what you believe orchestrated that?" Silence. She blinked. She looked prepared, and yet the directness unsettled her. "I'm not here to name individuals." "But you have," George responded evenly. "In interviews, in statements, and in legal filings." Meghan inhaled sharply. Her team stiffened behind the cameras, exchanging looks. This was not the controlled, predictable exchange they anticipated. I think, she said carefully, the problem is that people focus on the wrong details. They want drama, not understanding. George didn't lean back. Understanding comes from detail, he countered, and the public feels that your story shifts depending on the interview. A flush rose to her cheeks. That's not true. It's what many believe, George said quietly. Tonight is your opportunity to clarify. Meghan bit the inside of her cheek. This wasn't going the way she had hoped. She had expected gentle prompts, empathetic framing, maybe even a bit of implied sympathy. Instead, George was offering accountability, a rare, unsoftened kind. Let's take one example, he said. You've stated that certain comments made about your son were rooted in racial bias, but when asked who made the comments, you declined to specify. Many feel you created a global accusation without evidence. Meghan straightened, her voice sharpening. I never said I was lying. George didn't flinch. That's not the question. Her pulse quickened. She could feel it in her throat. He let the moment hang in the air until the tension became almost unbearable. Then George asked, why make the allegation if you weren't prepared to stand behind it fully? Her jaw tightened. Because the point wasn't to shame a person, it was about bringing awareness to... Awareness doesn't require secrecy, he cut in gently but firmly. You're twisting my words. I'm quoting them. The temperature in the room seemed to rise. Meghan's eyes glistened, not with tears, but with a kind of simmering disbelief that someone dared to push her this hard, this openly, on live television. George continued, voice low and deliberate. You've crafted a public image centered around transparency. But when transparency becomes selective, people begin to question intent. Meghan looked at him for a long moment. You're implying I'm being manipulative. I'm saying people are confused. I'm giving you the chance to resolve that confusion. Her throat bobbed. For the first time, Meghan Markle looked genuinely cornered, and the world watching from their living rooms, bars, and streaming screens leaned in closer, sensing that the conversation had crossed into dangerous, revealing territory. The atmosphere was heavy, electric, shifting. Meghan finally spoke softer this time. I have never, ever acted out of malice. George nodded slowly. But have you acted out of strategy? Her breath caught. That question hit her harder than anything else so far. A flicker, regret, defensiveness, anger flashed across her face. She fought to hide it, but the cameras caught everything. Before she could respond, George added quietly, there's a difference between protecting yourself and shaping a narrative. Meghan's composure began to crack, not in dramatic tears or explosive anger, but in the subtle ways someone reveals they weren't prepared for this depth of scrutiny.
The silence hung heavy, stretched so tightly it felt like a single breath could snap it. The studio lights hummed above them, casting a sharp glow on Meghan's face as she tried to collect herself. George remained still, hands folded, the posture of a man who understood the impact of patience. He didn't rush, didn't fill the space. He let the weight of the moment pull the truth forward from wherever she was hiding it. Meghan finally spoke, her voice steady but soft. I think everyone protects themselves. Anyone in my position would. George nodded, but he wasn't satisfied. Self-preservation isn't the issue. The question is whether your version of events changes based on audience, platform, or opportunity. She frowned, her jaw tightening. That's a very pointed accusation. It's an observation, he replied calmly, one that many share. The comment stung more than she expected. She brushed a strand of hair behind her ear, her mind racing for a response that wouldn't sound rehearsed. She had been through hundreds of interviews, but none like this. None where someone cut through the polishing, the branding, the calculated eloquence. George pressed on. Let's break this down. When you first spoke publicly about your experiences, the world reacted strongly, some in support, others with skepticism. But over time, discrepancies appeared. Small things, details that shifted. Her breath hitched. Like what? He leaned back, choosing his words with surgical precision. In one interview, you said you were silenced. In another, you said you were encouraged to speak. In one, you claimed your passport was taken. In another, you said you traveled frequently and freely. People see the contradictions, Meghan. Her eyes burned with a mix of frustration and disbelief. I was speaking from emotion. Trauma isn't linear. George held her gaze. That might explain some inconsistencies, yes, but not all. Her shoulders tensed. Behind the cameras, her team exchanged nervous glances. They knew the narrative they had prepared was slipping from her hands. They also knew they couldn't interfere now, not without making things worse. George continued, voice level and unwavering. You've described yourself as someone who simply wanted fairness, yet the public perceptions you helped shape, intentionally or unintentionally, have had enormous consequences for the royal family, for the media, for your own credibility. Meghan breathed slowly, measuredly, as if grounding herself. I told the truth as I experienced it. Experience, he replied, is subjective, but presentation is not. Her lips parted, but the words didn't come. George's tone softened, not out of sympathy, but because he understood the fragility of the moment. People aren't asking you to be perfect. They're asking for consistency. The room seemed to shrink around her. After a moment, Meghan spoke quietly. I was under immense pressure. Everything felt distorted. I said things in the heat of pain that later sounded different when I revisited them. George nodded once. That's fair. But when those statements shape public outrage, influence massive public debate, and even affect political discourse, you must acknowledge the responsibility that comes with that. The truth of that sentence hovered between them like a blade. Meghan swallowed, her voice barely above a whisper. I never meant for things to spiral the way they did. He didn't let her off easy, but you didn't stop them either. Her eyes glistened, not tears, not yet, but the threat of them. I was trying to protect my family. He leaned in slightly. Or your image. Her breath froze in her chest. The cameras caught everything, the tremor in her fingers, the way her shoulders stiffened, the way her eyes momentarily dropped before lifting again with visible effort. Meghan responded with a quiet intensity. I've been attacked relentlessly, hounded, misrepresented. I had to reclaim my own narrative. George studied her. That sounds like strategy again. Strategy is not a crime. No, but deflection can be. Her expression faltered. This wasn't hostility, it was exposure, and for the first time in years, Meghan Markle found herself without a shield. George shifted slightly, signaling the beginning of the interview's second arc. You've positioned yourself as a champion of openness, yet there were moments in your story that remained vague. Intentional omissions, emotional framing without supporting detail. Meghan took a slow breath. Not everything needs to be public. But you made it public, George countered, on your terms, selectively. She looked away, as if the lights were suddenly too bright. When the story is yours, she murmured, you tell the parts that matter, and leave out the parts that might create accountability. She snapped her gaze back at him, eyes blazing. That's not fair. It's a question, not an accusation. Her pulse raced. It feels like one. George's voice lowered, gentled only at the edges. Truth often feels like accusation when it exposes what we want hidden. Her breath caught again. The studio felt unbearably quiet. At last Meghan whispered, You think I manipulated the world. I think, George said evenly, you underestimated the world's ability to connect dots. Something in her expression changed. Not collapse, not defeat, but a realization that this interview had crossed the threshold into something she couldn't control. George continued, You are articulate, intelligent, charismatic. People don't doubt that. But charisma doesn't erase contradiction. And tonight, people are seeing a different side of this story, the side without layers of framing. Meghan's voice trembled slightly despite her efforts. I didn't expect this. I thought this would be a conversation, not an interrogation. He offered a small, almost sympathetic lift of his brow. Conversations become interrogations when questions go unanswered. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. He pressed gently. Meghan, is there anything you wish you had said differently? Something you wish you had clarified? Something the world misunderstood because of a narrative that wasn't fully accurate? The lights above them buzzed faintly, the only sound in the vast studio. Meghan breathed out slowly, controlled but shaken. There were moments, she admitted quietly, where I let my hurt speak louder than the facts. The words hit the room like a tremor. George didn't speak. He let the confessions settle. For the first time, she continued, I felt like I had a voice. And maybe I misused it at times. Not intentionally, but I can see how some things might have come across differently than I meant to. George nodded, acknowledging, not approving. Meghan's voice softened to nearly a whisper. I never meant for things to spiral the way they did. He backed off, finally easing the tension. And now you have been. She looked at him, really looked, seeing not an adversary but someone who had forced her to step out from behind the carefully curated image she had built. The camera slowly zoomed out. Meghan sat still, quieter than she had been in years. The facade cracked, the truth, raw, imperfect, finally visible. George clasped his hands, closing the moment with steady calm. Thank you, he said, for answering the hard questions. She nodded, her voice faint. Thank you for asking them. The director signaled cut. The light softened, the intensity dissolved, leaving only the lingering echo of a conversation that the world would dissect for years. And Meghan exhaled, not with relief, but with the dawning realization that this interview had changed something fundamental, in a way she could not yet define.